Hello, I am Bruce,
I'm Aditya.
and we are the Risky Scientists. So, this first episode, this inaugural episode, we said we were going to talk about panic. Yeah, so I think about it as an emotional response. If we're going to simplify human responses, particularly decision making, to the emotional and the rational,
Hmm.
to me, the term panic, that implies a bias towards more the emotional side, and that's not to say that these two states are binary and that we're not, and that we're either in one or the other, because that's
Yeah.
not true. We're always making decisions that are somewhat emotional, somewhat rational, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
But certainly, the term panic implies to me you're crossing a threshold there. I mean, I've written about this in the context of military decision making. When one reads military accounts of panic, they're crossing a threshold. You may hold on to your self control up to that threshold. You may come very close to that threshold. You're consciously controlling your emotions and controlling your urges to panic, and then you panic. You just cross that threshold, and then it's panic, and that can be expressed as running away or or seeking cover in the military, in a military context, or it could become irrational. So doing things that are not in your best interest, so just
Hmm.
freezing with panic. That's a bad form of panic, which we should discuss.
Yes.
So I think the term to me implies this bias towards an emotional response, and it does in popular literature. I think it implies something negative, but we should discuss how panic can be positive. It can help you make
Yeah.
certainly quicker decisions, and
Mm.
possibly they might be even more sensible decisions if you are able to escape um, rational deadlock in your own decision making, or perhaps a mass of emotions which you cannot untangle rationally. Sometimes panic can untangle it by default, and that might be a good thing. But what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a nice way of capturing it. I think of panic somewhat similarly. I would to use some language that others may or may not be familiar with. I think of Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, writes about it in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about these kind of proxies. Again, you're never in one system of thinking or the other, but he talks about a high speed intuitive way of thinking, i.e., system one, and system two is being much more of a rational, deliberative process. And I think panic is perhaps the extreme version of system one, where one needs to react in the moment immediately, and it could perhaps be useful. I think you were describing several behaviors of panic, whether that's standing still, feeling stuck, which would probably a terrible thing, but also perhaps running away is a good thing if there's danger.
Yeah.
Which brings me to kind of a question that I've been wondering about, which is we hear so much now about panic buying, and is that good? Is that something that people should be doing?
So let's discuss that panic buying. That's a good segue, because panic buying, that could be rational.
Okay, absolutely.
It could be rational, or it could be um, a wholly emotional panic response that, as has been criticized by a lot of media outlets, and politicians for that matter, it's been criticized as irrational and bad for society as a whole. So
Right.
that's, so what do you think about panic buying?
Yes. I mean, we're hearing about panic buying so much nowadays, and I feel like it's in the news every day. It feels like there is a trade-off somewhere along there where some amount of panic buying actually is rational. I think in times of crises, and in the scenario that one would be confined to one's home for an indefinite period of time, it is in fact somewhat sensible to be stocking up on materials. But I'm very cognizant when I say that. I'm also very cognizant of the data, and the data that tells me that there is a shortage of some supplies, and some supplies would be for an overall social good would be better off in hospitals. So it overall, on the large scale, panic buying of masks when you're sitting at home is probably not a rational decision, because you want to make sure there are enough doctors in the hospitals to treat you if you do become ill, and you keeping the mask for yourself when you're just breathing the air inside of your house is perhaps a little bit silly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think for those who are out there at Costco, standing in line trying to buy as much as they can, some part of it might be rational, the stocking up process, but it also feels to me that people may not be thinking quite about exposure, that we are panicking, but we're also panicking and reacting to an invisible enemy, so to speak, or an invisible virus. And so it seems to me that perhaps people are taking quite some risks just standing in line in Costco that may not be worth it, even if some amount of hoarding is rational.
Yeah. So there's a few dimensions there. I mean, we can certainly talk about exposure in a risk analytic sense,
Yeah,
and the public may not be mindful. They may not be aware of the trade-off that they are engaging in. That trade-off, the trade-off you just described,
yeah,
they are trading off how they reserve against one risk, which would be a lack of supplies. So they are rationally hoarding now
yeah,
against the possibility of shortages in the future. So that's rational. That's perfectly rational. We should be hoarding, right? So that's not to say that hoarding cannot be um, bad for society as a whole if everybody's hoarding and the supplies don't then
absolutely,
get to the most needy parts of society. Then that's bad for society as a whole. But that doesn't mean that your hoarding is irrational. At a personal level, that's perfectly rational for you to hoard. You are in risk management terms, you are reserving resources against the possibility of future shortages. So that's rational. But
absolutely,
then but people should be mindful of the trade-off they're making when they're going out into society now in order to acquire those resources. So now they're going to Costco,
yes,
or we don't want to pick on Costco, but they may send us letters saying, "Why did you make this example out of us?" Any grocery store, so any grocery store,
yes,
it's a pretty closed environment, lots of recirculated air, and lots of people inside. So you are rationally controlling one risk by hoarding against future loss of supply, but you are taking on a new risk, which is exposure to other human beings who may be carriers. So that's a trade-off that you can make, right? So in risk management, we do take trade-offs because
absolutely,
we're dealing with uncertainty,
yeah,
and if you've weighed up that risk, then there's certainly nothing irrational about what you're doing.
yeah.
You just be mindful about uh, the risk calculation you're actually making.
I think you bring up a lot of very, very valuable points, which is that panic um, is sometimes a trade-off, and so that kind of leads me to the question of um, can panic be good? Are there times in which you should panic? Are there times in which maybe that trade-off falls in favor of panicking?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? and
It is.
pertinent. There are some implications in the way we've just defined and conceptualized panic for this. So,
Yes.
if panic, um, if panic is making you blind to the trade-offs you're making, then that part of it is not good. So, if you are if you were literally panicking and rushing out of your home and saying, "I've got to go buy toilet paper at the nearest grocery store, and I'm not even thinking about the other risks I'm taking." Right, so now I'm rushing over the road and I'm not looking for traffic, and now I'm rushing into the crowd and I'm fighting with the crowd for the toilet paper, and
Yeah.
I'm not thinking about the social contagion possibilities. Right, if it's that sort of panic, then panic is causing you causing you more risks that you would not necessarily take if you were thinking more reasonably. So if you are outside of panic. So in that sense, panic, that's a form of panic which is going to expose you to more risk. But we shouldn't, like I said earlier, we shouldn't deny that panic can be useful. So if you're converse, if we take this converse imaginary character that is just sitting there
Yeah.
and saying, "Oh, everybody else is panicking. It'll all blow over soon. I don't care what the government is telling me, the warnings they're telling me. I don't care. You know, when people tell me to have an emergency kit at all times in my home, I don't care about that."
Yeah.
Now that person probably could usefully panic. That's where panic could be useful to that person, because the panic would take over their lethargy or their cynicism or their skepticism or whatever it is that is stopping them from acting. Panic would seize control of them and get them to do something potentially useful like hoarding. Right?
Yes. So I mean, it almost sounds like the way you're describing it. You're describing panic as a catalyst, and that
Yeah,
it that it can be useful when we are otherwise too slow.
yeah, certainly. Right. So yeah, if we're too slow, so if we are waiting for more data uh, to confirm that we need to panic, and then that more data is that everybody around us is dropping dead from a highly infectious disease, it's too late. We've waited too late.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that speaks to the speed accuracy trade off as what decision makers um, often train.
Yes.
They train say soldiers. So let me continue with this example of soldiers.
Mhm.
But it's you can easily imagine anybody anybody can imagine themselves having experienced this trade-off
Right.
where you're trying to make a decision and you're waiting, you're pondering it because you're pursuing accuracy. So you want an accurate decision. So should you buy that car? Is it the best car? I'm going to compare the cars. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to ponder it. I'm going to do some more research, perhaps. I'm going to take my time because I want an accurate decision. This is a major investment. So I want an accurate decision. I don't want to regret this. But at the same time, waiting for an accurate decision, taking your time, that's against the desirable virtue of speed, a speedy decision. So you face this trade-off in most decisions, speed versus accuracy. And in emergencies, we want speed. We want to react quickly and preempt things.
Yeah.
At the same time, we do want an accurate decision. So we don't want to control the wrong virus, or we don't want to issue a vaccine which is actually risky for other reasons,
Yes.
or it's not proven yet. So policymakers face this trade-off. We face this trade-off as individuals, and
Yes.
it and usually when it's trained, or the best you can do, and this may not be very satisfying for the trainee, but the best you can do is to say to people, just be mindful of it. Just be mindful that you are engaged in that trade-off, and that will help guide you towards balancing the trade-off to ultimately some decision that is sufficiently fast and sufficiently accurate, but maybe not perfect in either.
Absolutely. It makes me think of maybe there are things we can do to get ourselves more used to that panic. I mean, I had a coach who would always tell me, you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. I know you have a lot of experience, Bruce, with thinking about how military personnel, especially in special operations and the like, are in these very dangerous, very risky scenarios. How do they channel the panic? Is there anything we can learn from that?
Well, at those extremes of the population, so special operations personnel, they're very rare personnel within the military even,
Right.
and the military is a rare profession within society as a whole. And consequently, it's quite a rare science. So it's quite difficult to know how even these special operations personnel are doing it themselves.
Yeah.
There are some observable indicators, highly observable correlates of what's going on in their minds. So we know that it's not just special operations personnel. It could be first responders
Mm-hmm.
who
Yeah.
deal with emergencies all the time and take risks all the time. So they show up at let's take firefighters. They have to go into the burning building, so they're taking risks. So
Yes.
how do they handle that? And we know that these elite personnel, we can observe the same physiological reactions in them that you would in somebody who may be panicking. But the difference is that they don't have the same psychological reactions. They certainly don't have the same psychological stress.
Yeah.
Right? So we should talk about stress, because stress is one of the factors towards the wrong sort of panic. So stress, we know that stress can close down decision making. So people are under stress. This is why stress is an awful experience for many reasons, and it can be very damaging physiologically. So it can have physical effects on one's bodily health,
Right.
and it's an awful feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And further, it can close down decision making, so people become paralyzed under stress, and that refers back to how I described the worst kind of panic is the one that makes you freeze. So
True.
panic was developed by our ancestors in much riskier direct forms of riskier situations than the ones we live in, where they're living with things that can eat them, and they don't have firearms to defend themselves and all that sort of thing, and they need panic. So they've evolved with panic
Yes.
to help them with the fight and flight response. So they're going to flight, right? So the flight is to flee, run away, or they're going to fight with the threat. So they're going to fight back at the saber-toothed tiger with what weapons they have. And in both of those cases, those forms of panic may be perfectly correct in that particular situation. But what's not correct is to freeze and do nothing. Not usually. I suppose there might be a situation where that is correct. So if you freeze and the threat doesn't see you, so there may be a biological imperative for that under certain situations, but for the human being, that's not normally true. We don't want to freeze in place when somebody's shooting firearms at us. We don't want to freeze and do nothing if the infection is spreading to our neighborhood. Now, so some persons can retain the physiological advantages of panic, which is alertness, mindfulness, a
Mm.
rise in energy, a feeling of imperative to act, respond, react. So that physiological response, so that the flood of adrenaline,
Yes.
that can be useful. And the people who handle these situations well, they don't lose those physiological responses. They just channel them towards more decisive responses, maybe with combining more trained responses. So they're not necessarily thinking about what they're doing, because they've trained to act in this situation under modeled conditions. They're better prepared to act correctly in the real condition, the analogous real condition, And so you often hear soldiers saying, my training just took over. I didn't know what I was doing. My training just took over, and I defeated the enemy, I fought through the enemy, or I escaped the enemy, or I took cover, or whatever it is. Now, that physiologically that can look like panic, but externally, objectively, that can look like rational, controlled response. So certainly the right form of panic can be trained. And in
Right.
fact, I say the right form of panic for the people who are trained. They probably would not want it to be called panic, right? Because they're saying, I'm following my training. I'm a professional. This is a professional response, and they're not even conscious of the physiological response. So there is actually research that people like special operations personnel, they're not even aware that they're alert in a physiological sense. They're just not aware because their psychology is so highly trained that they don't register their physiological hyper alertness as stress. They don't register it as stress, and they don't register it as anything negative. It's just, I'm alert, I'm ready to go, whatever it is, right? So certainly the correct panic response can be trained, or it can be directed, and it can certainly be made useful.
Well, it's that's a fascinating example of special operations, and it you were comparing it to the fight or flight response that our ancestors perhaps had to use quite often, and in a way, I suppose we can think of ourselves as having been trained in that response by our ancestors and over history, and
Yeah, thank you, ancestors.
indeed. But perhaps there's also, it sounds like there's some say that we have in practicing reacting under stress in ways that are productive as opposed to becoming the proverbial deer in the headlights.
Yeah, that's
Well,
right.
no, that's absolutely fascinating, and it starts to make me think of how can we apply that training to the current situation. How should we, or should we panic at all about COVID-19 right here and right now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what do you think? Because um, it makes me think. As a risk scientist, I want data, and you're the data scientist, and it's very easy for me to turn the problem in its early stages. Any problem in its early stages, I can turn over to the data scientist and say, give me some give me some models about where this is going to go, and or just give me some frequency data that I can turn into probabilities or something like that. And I know the data are immature. I think that's the best way to say it, right? So,
Yeah,
and whenever I hear epidemiologists talking about COVID-19, there's a lot of we don't know yet. We don't know. They're hesitant to say because even though we've got hundreds of thousands of cases by now, just so few of them have been researched to a sufficient clinical level to derive much meaning from it. So as a risk scientist, I get very nervous when epidemiologists are saying we don't know, because there's not a lot I can do with that as a risk scientist. I don't know, you can't tell me the parameters of this risk. I can't manage it.
yes.
How do you think about the data?
I think that's well said. There are a lot of uncertainties, certainly, about COVID-19 right now, and I think countries all over the world um, are doing some more than others, are doing what they can to get more data, to gather more data, and so are scientists. But I think even in the face of uncertainty, there are certain trends that are already starting to emerge that are quite unmistakable. I think I would wager with a fairly high degree of certainty that we are seeing exponential growth right now. We are seeing every week or so, we're seeing a doubling in the number of cases of COVID-19.
Yeah,
And
or in Europe, generally, we in most countries now we're seeing a daily doubling. So
absolutely. So we're
Europe
seeing
is some
this,
weeks ahead of America. Yeah.
yeah, we're seeing quite staggering growth, and I think anytime you see exponential growth, uh, you should have your whiskers up, so to speak, and be very aware and be ready to act. I think the rate at which COVID-19 seems to be growing um, is reason to panic in the right ways, of course. Panic in the sense of using our stress and using our fear to allow us to act more quickly. I don't think it's perhaps a reason to become paralyzed, but I think it is that one trend in and of itself is certainly concerning to me so
So
far.
can you just explain that trend to our listeners? So you talk about exponential. I mean, that is a statistical term that some I should say, for me, it's statistical and
Yeah.
probabilistic, but it's a wider mathematical term. Can you just explain that to our listeners?
Absolutely. So an exponential growth is basically a one way to think about it is a consecutive squaring or a consecutive doubling. So every week or every day, you double the number of cases. And the reason that this is quite concerning is because anytime you have what we call exponential growth, uh, it starts off very innocuously. If I were to give you an exponential series, it starts off as 2 and then 4 and then 8, all numbers that seem relatively small. But in a matter of 10 days, if you have a series that goes like that, you will be around 1,000. Um, and then in 10 more days, you don't just add, you square, and 1,000 squared suddenly becomes a million. So I think exponential growth is a form of growth that every certain period of time you square the number of cases. And so you can imagine, again, with the series that I gave you, in 30 days or about a month, you could have up to a billion cases. There are things I think epidemiologists are recommending to help us reduce that. You've probably heard the term flatten the curve, but the growth of cases is described in this doubling pattern that starts off very innocuously and very slow, but then suddenly becomes very difficult mentally to even comprehend these very large numbers. And that's why I think it's quite scary because at some point the bear is upon you, so to speak, and it no longer looks like a bear. It just it's this big mass, and you can't even make sense of it.
Yeah. So let's make some promises for our listeners. So
Yes.
we plan on talking like this and releasing it publicly once a week.
Yes.
If something dramatic changes and we see an opportunity to discuss that immediately, we shall do so, whether we're due to on our schedule of once a week or not. I think we should invite listeners to send us questions that they think we should discuss. They
Absolutely.
can tweet us at Risky Scientists. They can find
Yes.
us on Twitter at Risky Scientists. So please tweet to us, send us the questions that we should be discussing. We want to know how we can better serve the audience, not just ourselves. We're not just talking for our own benefit. Although let me say how stimulating this has been to talk with you, Aditya. Always a pleasure and always mind growing.
Likewise. Thanks so much for the conversation, Bruce. Thank you
To
all. Stay safe and stay sane, and we'll talk to you again soon.
yeah, we are the Risky Scientists. Thank you for listening.